Opening up diagonal control and seizing central space, this pawn advance sets the stage for immediate piece development and potential pawn breaks. Instantly establishing asymmetry, Sicilian players embrace dynamic counterplay and often steer games towards sharp, unbalanced positions. Centralizing the knight prepares d4 and contests the d5 square, a classic Sicilian setup. Opening the path for the queen's bishop, black prepares a solid pawn structure in the center. Unlocking the center's power, white boldly challenges black's pawn structure and opens diagonals for swift development, setting the stage for dynamic play. Embracing the open center, black sacrifices central space for freedom of action and potential piece activity. Recapturing centrally establishes a powerful pawn presence and frees your knight for active development, aiming for queenside pressure. Developing the knight to a natural outpost, this move prepares for a solid pawn structure and contest in the center. Pressuring the c7 square immediately, this gambit offers a pawn for rapid development and potential central control. Solidifying the pawn center, d6 prepares development and anchors the queenside against aggressive knight incursions. Safeguarding the pawn on d4 and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this bishop develops actively, eyeing the c7 square and potentially restricting black's queenside mobility. Asserting central presence, black immediately challenges the aggressive knight and expands their own dominion, aiming to dismantle white's early spatial advantage and potentially prepare for a queenside buildup. Steering the bishop to a diagonal that contests black's central pawn expansion offers a nuanced positional battle, aiming to control key squares and potentially restrict black's development while maintaining a solid structure. Unleashing a subtle pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's knight's comfortable outpost on b5, forcing it to retreat and potentially creating a pawn chain that grants more central influence. This also opens a path for the queen to potentially redeploy or support future pawn advances. Reclaiming the outpost on c3 immediately addresses the knight's vulnerable position after black's aggressive pawn push and knight development, preparing to contest the center and potentially exploit the open d-file if the position simplifies. Developing the knight here perfectly prepares for the d5 pawn push, aiming to seize central space and potentially unhinge white's slightly awkward bishop placement on e3. Sharpening the diagonal pressure, the bishop now eyes the vulnerable f7 square, potentially setting up a future attack or restricting black's kingside mobility as white builds a commanding central presence. Finally, black consolidates their pawn structure and prepares to castle, solidifying the kingside and allowing the rook to become active soon. Flipping the script, the knight brazenly advances to d5, aiming to control the d6 square and potentially fork the king and rook if black isn't careful, while also clearing the path for other pieces to join the fray. Opening up lines and clarifying the center, this knight exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially paving the way for a more open game or creating isolated pawns depending on white's recapture. Liberating the bishop from its pin on the c4 square allows white to eye the kingside more directly, while simultaneously clearing the d-file for potential future pressure. This repositioning subtly increases the pressure on black's center, particularly the d6 pawn, which is now under closer scrutiny. It's a move that, while seemingly simple, opens up a range of dynamic possibilities, hinting at future kingside attacks or a solidifying of white's central influence. The exchange on d5 was perhaps inevitable, and now the focus shifts to how this bishop can best serve white's ambitions. Castling kingside immediately shores up your monarch, escaping the central tension and preparing to activate your rook. Opening up the c-file for potential pressure on the queenside, this knight repositioning simultaneously prepares for kingside castling and allows for greater flexibility in piece development, avoiding the somewhat awkward placement of the knight on b5. Initiating a slight repositioning of the monarch to a more secure alcove away from the central storm offers a subtle but significant improvement in king safety, especially as white's pieces are poised to potentially exert pressure on the kingside, effectively tucking the king behind a pawn shield and freeing up the g8 square for potential defensive maneuvers or future pawn advances. Securing the king on its new homestead frees up the rooks to potentially contest central files or even embark on the ambitious b-file invasion. The immediate tactical implications, while not glaring, revolve around the delicate balance of piece activity and the subtle pressure white can now exert, unburdened by immediate kingside defensive duties. Preparing to challenge the centralized bishop and potentially disrupt white's knight outpost on c3, black aims to free their own piece structure. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a potential kingside advance, the bishop vacates the diagonal previously occupied by the knight, aiming to exploit the now less defended dark squares around black's king, while simultaneously opening lines for other pieces. Challenging the bishop's outpost on b3, this knight maneuver initiates a dynamic redistribution of forces, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses along the queenside and disrupt white's pawn structure. Reasserting the knight's dominance on d5, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the king. Striking at white's knight on b3, black seeks to disrupt the pawn structure and gain a better diagonal for their bishop, potentially unbalancing the position by trading off a knight for a less active piece. Opening the file creates immediate potential for pressure against black's queenside, but also weakens the pawn structure around white's king. Sacrificing the bishop on d5 clears lines and initiates a fascinating positional interplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a strong outpost for black's knights. The queen's redeployment to d5 immediately targets the weakness on f7, creating an uncomfortable pin for black's king and potentially setting up dangerous discoveries later on. Black finally commits to a centralizing pawn structure with the queen, aiming to coordinate her pieces and prepare for potential pawn breaks, while simultaneously offering a pawn sacrifice if white overextends in the center. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure provides a stable base for future operations, preventing any immediate queenside expansion by black and preparing to potentially challenge the central d-file. Unleashing this pawn advance signals a bold attempt to seize initiative on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. Unleashing the rook to the fourth rank, white intends to exert pressure along the open file, aiming to disrupt black's kingside structure and potentially prepare a central breakthrough or wing attack. Carrying the rook to the d-file aims to activate it and prepare for a potential advance on the kingside, perhaps with g4, while also offering counterplay along the open file. Focusing on controlling the b-file, this repositioning of the rook aims to exploit the open file created by white's doubled pawns and potentially target black's queenside. It's a subtle shift, creating latent pressure and preparing for future pawn advances or piece exchanges that might weaken black's defenses. Burying the rook behind its own pawns on the queenside, an uninspired defense, risks passive play while white's pieces, especially the knight on d5, maintains significant central influence and attacking potential, potentially leading to a cramped position for black if not carefully managed. Initiating a probing maneuver, white thrusts the rook to the sixth rank, aiming to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. This aggressive positioning on an open file immediately challenges black's defensive setup and demands a thoughtful response, as a misstep could lead to a compromised position or tactical disadvantage. The black king now retreats to a safer square, out of the immediate line of fire of the rook, preparing to potentially reinforce the kingside or support a more active pawn push. Initiating a fascinating duel for the file, white aims to finally exert pressure on this open highway after a lengthy maneuvering phase. The queen's repositioning on the queenside suggests a shift in strategic focus, perhaps looking to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's slightly passive pawn structure on the kingside. Consider how this action could potentially restrict black's counterplay and free up white's pieces for more active roles. Black's f-pawn push aims to disrupt white's comfortable rook positioning on the queenside, threatening to pry open the f-file for potential counterplay against the white king should it remain on g1. This bold advance challenges white's spatial advantage, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing a reevaluation of white's queenside structure. It's a decisive attempt to inject dynamism into a rather static position, prioritizing active piece play over maintaining perfect pawn harmony. Unlocking the F file. This capture immediately challenges Black's kingside structure and introduces dynamic play as White gains a foothold where none existed before. Unleashing the rook to the F file is a bold declaration, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. This aggressive maneuver sacrifices a pawn, a common theme in Sicilian defenses when Black seeks dynamic counterplay. The tension now shifts dramatically as White must decide whether to accept the pawn and enter a potentially sharp tactical sequence, or to retreat and allow Black to consolidate their initiative. The placement of this rook signifies a clear intention to seize the initiative and force the play, turning a seemingly static position into a volatile battleground where every move will be scrutinized for its tactical implications. That rook retreat might seem passive, but it's a subtle maneuver to preserve the piece and potentially redeploy it to a more active file or even a defensive post, while simultaneously creating a space to untangle other pieces and maintain pressure on Black's potentially overextended pawn structure. A bold repositioning of the rook to *f8*, aiming to defend the pawn on *f5 and prepare for potential advances on the kingside, whilst also eyeing the open *f* file should it materialize. The rook embarks on a surprising journey, targeting the exposed enemy monarch. The queen's repositioning here aims to untangle the piece structure and prepare for future central pawn breaks, but it neglects the growing pressure on the kingside. Opening the 7th rank with the rook immediately offers a flexible outlet, aiming to unblock the pawn chain and challenge the opponent's control of the central files. Opening a diagonal for the queen, the Black queen heads toward the kingside, eyeing potential attacking avenues and seeking to participate more actively in the game's unfolding drama. Initiating a pawn advance along the queenside often signals an intention to challenge Black's entrenched position, aiming to pry open lines or gain essential squares. Unleashing the b-pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt White's rook presence on the queenside and potentially create new avenues for Black's pieces, particularly the bishop on e6, which is currently somewhat restricted. Squeezing the rook onto the 7th rank, White forces Black to confront the potential for a devastating invasion, creating a crucial decision point for the defender. Unleashing a pawn thrust at the rook, Black seeks to disrupt White's control of the queenside and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it also creates a target for the advancing pawns on the c-file. The rook's daring excursion to the 7th rank now forces Black to confront a significant spatial imbalance, potentially creating vulnerabilities in their pawn structure and king's safety as White seeks to exploit the open files. Unleashing a daring counterattack, Black gambits a pawn to disrupt White's rook-laden queenside and open attacking avenues, seizing initiative in a complex middle game. Unleashing a powerful pawn storm, this advance aims to shatter Black's defensive shield and expose the monarch to ruinous attack. Reclaiming the rook immediately addresses the bold queen sacrifice attempt, rebalancing material and preventing any immediate fireworks for White's queen. Reclaiming the open file, White's rook lands on a crucial diagonal, immediately challenging Black's pawn structure and threatening to penetrate further into their territory. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank, while seemingly active, opens a fascinating can of worms regarding defensive coordination and the king's safety. Black is indeed seizing immediate initiative, but one must scrutinize whether this forward placement truly bolsters the monarch, or rather isolates vulnerable pawns and creates potential targets for a well-aimed counterattack. The queenside pawns now present a curious, fragmented structure, inviting consideration of how they might be leveraged or, conversely, become liabilities as the position unfolds. By sacrificing the bishop on g5, White initiates a daring assault, aiming to expose the Black king through a sudden flurry of attacking pieces. This bold exchange opens critical lines and introduces immediate threats, forcing Black to defend with precision lest their king find itself fatally vulnerable. The resulting position is highly tactical, with White leveraging the unleashed energy of their remaining forces against Black's somewhat dispersed army. It's a dynamic shift, injecting a sharp, aggressive character into the proceedings and testing black's defensive capabilities under pressure. A desperate king check. This diagonal invasion is black's last gasp for air, aiming to disrupt white's burgeoning kingside attack and perhaps even create counterplay through the unsettled pawn structure. While it forces a reaction, it also exposes the black king even further, potentially inviting white's pieces into devastating attacking positions after the check is resolved. The question is whether this temporary disruption is enough to offset the inherent positional disadvantages black has accumulated. Securing the monarch's escape route becomes paramount, with the king suddenly exposed to the dangerous diagonal. Suddenly, the queens clash in the center, a sharp tactical geometry unfolding as black attempts to exploit white's slightly awkward rook placement. Asserting dominance on the queen side, the rook transfer aims to capitalize on the open file and pressure black's weakened pawn structure, forcing a strategic reevaluation from the opponent. Securing the g2 pawn feels like a priority, offering a lifeline to the exposed monarch, though it does grant white a crucial tempo to rally their forces. Exploiting the exposed black monarch, the rook decisively seizes the 7th rank, establishing a powerful battery and threatening immediate mate.